Colonel Takeshi Yamamoto stood in the humid darkness of a Guadalcanal warehouse, his flashlight beam cutting through the tropical night as it illuminated row after row of wooden crates stretching into the shadows. It was October 1942, and his forces had just overrun an abandoned American supply depot during what would later be known as the Battle for Henderson Field. What he expected to find was perhaps a few hundred rounds of ammunition, maybe some medical supplies, the kind of modest haul that might sustain his regiment for a week or two. What he found instead would haunt him for the rest of his life. 50,000 ammunition crates, each one packed with rifle rounds, machine gun belts, mortar shells, and artillery projectiles. Enough firepower to supply an entire division for months of intensive combat. As Yamamoto's men pried open crate after crate, revealing the seemingly endless abundance within, the colonel felt something cold settle in his stomach. Not fear of the enemy, but the dawning realization that Japan might have picked a fight with an opponent whose resources were beyond anything he had imagined. This is the story of a moment that changed everything, not just for one Japanese commander, but for the entire strategic understanding of the Pacific War. It's the story of how a single captured supply depot revealed the true scale of American industrial might, and how that revelation rippled through the Japanese command structure, ultimately contributing to a fundamental shift in how Japan's leaders viewed their chances of victory. The Pacific War had been raging for nearly a year when Colonel Yamamoto made his discovery. Pearl Harbor had been a stunning tactical success, crippling the American Pacific Fleet and giving Japan the breathing room it needed to expand across the Pacific. In the months that followed, Japanese forces had swept across Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands with breathtaking speed, capturing Hong Kong, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, and the Philippines. To many Japanese officers, including Yamamoto himself, these early victories seemed to confirm what their leaders had been telling them: that American democracy was soft, that American soldiers lacked the fighting spirit of the Imperial Japanese Army, and that America's industrial capacity, while impressive on paper, could never match the efficiency and dedication of Japanese war production. Yamamoto had been a career officer in the Imperial Japanese Army, rising through the ranks during Japan's expansion into Manchuria and China. He had seen firsthand how Japanese forces could overcome seemingly impossible odds through superior training, discipline, and what the Japanese called Yamato Damashi, the spirit of Japan. When war came with America, he had no doubt that these same qualities would prove decisive. The early months of the Pacific War seemed to bear out this confidence. American forces had been caught off guard at Pearl Harbor, overwhelmed in the Philippines, and outfought in the early naval engagements. Japanese Zero fighters dominated the skies, Japanese naval forces controlled the seas, and Japanese ground troops seemed unstoppable in jungle warfare. But by the summer of 1942, subtle signs were beginning to suggest that the tide might be turning. The Battle of the Coral Sea in May had been tactically inconclusive, but it had cost Japan valuable aircraft carriers and experienced pilots. The Battle of Midway in June had been a devastating defeat, with 4 Japanese carriers sunk and the cream of Japan's naval aviation destroyed. Still, many Japanese commanders, including Yamamoto, believed these setbacks were temporary. Japan's industrial base was working at full capacity, new ships and aircraft were being produced, and the fighting spirit of Japanese forces remained unbroken. What they needed was a decisive victory that would force America to negotiate a peace settlement that would leave Japan's Pacific Empire intact. Guadalcanal seemed like the perfect place to achieve that victory. The island was strategically located in the Solomon Islands chain, positioned to threaten Allied supply lines to Australia. More importantly, the Americans had landed there in August 1942, giving Japan an opportunity to engage American ground forces in the kind of decisive battle that Japanese military doctrine favored. The campaign for Guadalcanal began with typical Japanese confidence. The island's garrison was small, the American landing force appeared to be of modest size, and Japanese naval and air forces were well positioned to support ground operations. Yamamoto's regiment was part of the reinforcements sent to drive the Americans back into the sea and secure Japan's southern defensive perimeter. The initial Japanese attacks had achieved some success. American positions around Henderson Field, The airstrip that was the key to controlling the island had been probed and tested. Japanese naval forces had won several nighttime engagements, earning the waters around Guadalcanal the nickname Iron Bottom Sound for all the ships that had been sunk there. It was during one of these probing attacks that Yamamoto's forces had overrun the American supply depot. The attack itself had been a minor tactical success, a night raid that had caught a small American detachment off guard and forced them to withdraw. But as dawn broke and Yamamoto's men began to explore what they had captured, the colonel realized that this minor victory had revealed something far more significant than anyone had anticipated. The first thing that struck Yamamoto was the sheer quantity of supplies. His own regiment had been operating on carefully rationed ammunition for weeks, with each soldier carrying only what he could carry, and resupply coming in dangerous nighttime runs by fast destroyers. The idea that the Americans could simply abandon 50,000 crates of ammunition suggested a level of abundance that seemed almost wasteful. But as Yamamoto examined the crates more closely, he began to understand that this wasn't wasteful abundance, it was systematic oversupply. The Americans weren't just bringing enough ammunition for their immediate needs, they were bringing enough for sustained, intensive combat operations that might last for months. They were planning not just to hold Guadalcanal, but to use it as a base for further operations. The quality of the American ammunition was another revelation. Yamamoto had expected to find hastily manufactured supplies, perhaps with quality control issues that would reflect the strain of rapid wartime production. Instead, the ammunition was uniformly excellent, precisely manufactured, properly packaged, and clearly produced by an industrial system that was operating at peak efficiency. Each crate was marked with production codes that told a story of American industrial capacity. The ammunition had been manufactured at dozens of different facilities across the United States, then shipped thousands of miles across the Pacific to support operations on a remote island that most Americans probably couldn't find on a map. The logistics required for such an operation were staggering, but perhaps most unsettling of all was the casual nature of the American supply system. These weren't precious resources that had been carefully hoarded and transported at great risk. They were routine supplies, delivered as part of a regular logistics operation that seemed to assume unlimited industrial capacity and unlimited transportation resources. Yamamoto had grown up in a Japan where every bullet was precious, where steel was carefully rationed, and where military operations were planned around the assumption that supplies would always be limited. The idea that an army could operate with such abundance of material was foreign to his entire military experience. As his men continued to inventory the captured supplies, Yamamoto began to do some rough calculations. If this was just one supply depot for one American division on one island, what did that suggest about the total scale of American war production? How many factories would be required to produce this much ammunition? How many ships would be needed to transport it? How many workers would be required to manufacture, package, and ship these supplies? The numbers he arrived at were deeply troubling. If his estimates were correct, American war production was operating on a scale that dwarfed anything Japan could match. The industrial capacity that could casually abandon 50,000 crates of ammunition was the same capacity that was producing ships, aircraft, and weapons at rates that Japan could never hope to equal. This realization was made more bitter by Yamamoto's knowledge of Japan's own supply situation. His regiment had been operating on reduced rations for weeks. Ammunition was carefully rationed, with strict orders against wasteful firing. Medical supplies were running low, and replacement equipment was becoming increasingly difficult to obtain. The contrast between Japanese scarcity and American abundance was stark and undeniable. While Japanese forces were being told to make do with less, American forces were apparently operating with more supplies than they could even use effectively. This wasn't just a difference in industrial capacity, it was a difference in the fundamental approach to warfare. Japanese military doctrine had always emphasized the importance of spirit over material, of quality over quantity, of careful planning over brute force. But what Yamamoto was seeing suggested that American military doctrine was based on the assumption that material abundance could overcome any disadvantage in training or fighting spirit. The implications of this discovery went far beyond the immediate tactical situation on Guadalcanal. If America could supply its forces with such abundance, It could afford to take casualties that would be devastating to Japanese forces. It could afford to learn from its mistakes, to replace lost equipment quickly, and to sustain operations over extended periods that would exhaust Japanese resources. More troubling still was the realization that this abundance was probably increasing rather than decreasing. While Japan's industrial capacity was being strained to its limits by the demands of global war, American industrial capacity was probably just hitting its stride. The factories that had produced these supplies were likely producing even more supplies for other operations around the globe. Yamamoto had been trained to think of war as a contest of wills, where victory would go to the side with greater determination and fighting spirit. But the evidence before him suggested that this war would be decided by industrial capacity and logistical efficiency, areas where America held overwhelming advantages. The captured intelligence documents found among the supplies painted an even more sobering picture. American planning documents revealed operations being planned on a scale that seemed almost fantastical to Japanese eyes. The Americans weren't just thinking about holding Guadalcanal. They were planning island-hopping campaigns that would require hundreds of ships, thousands of aircraft, and millions of tons of supplies. These weren't the desperate plans of a nation fighting for survival. They were the confident plans of a nation that expected to win through the systematic application of overwhelming material superiority. The Americans were planning to win the war not through brilliant tactics or superior fighting spirit, but through the simple expedient of producing more weapons, more ships, and more ammunition than Japan could possibly match. As October turned to November, and the battle for Guadalcanal intensified, Yamamoto found his initial discovery confirmed by everything he observed. American forces seemed to have unlimited ammunition for their artillery and mortars. Their aircraft appeared in formations that suggested abundant fuel supplies and extensive pilot training. Their medical facilities were equipped with supplies and equipment that Japanese forces could only dream of. The final confirmation came during the naval battles of November 12-15, when Japanese and American fleets clashed in a series of engagements that would determine the fate of Guadalcanal. Yamamoto watched from the shore as the night sky lit up with gunfire and explosions, knowing that the outcome of these battles would determine whether his forces could continue to receive supplies or would be cut off and left to fight with whatever they had on hand. When dawn broke on November 15th, the results were clear. Japanese naval forces had been defeated, and the supply runs that had kept Japanese forces on Guadalcanal barely alive were no longer possible. The Americans, meanwhile, continued to receive regular supply convoys that brought not just ammunition and food, but heavy equipment, vehicles, and reinforcements. The contrast was devastating and undeniable. While Japanese forces were being slowly starved of supplies, American forces were being continuously reinforced and resupplied. The 50,000 ammunition crates that Yamamoto had captured in October were just a tiny fraction of the supplies that continued to flow to American forces throughout the campaign. As 1942 drew to a close, Yamamoto found himself facing a terrible truth. The war that Japan had started with such confidence was turning into exactly the kind of prolonged conflict that Japanese leaders had hoped to avoid. And in that kind of war, the side with greater industrial capacity and more abundant resources would ultimately prevail. The young officer who had entered the war believing in the superiority of Japanese fighting spirit was beginning to understand that spirit alone might not be enough. The 50,000 ammunition crates had revealed a truth that would reshape his understanding of the war and Japan's chances of victory. But the full implications of that discovery were yet to be revealed, and the lessons learned on Guadalcanal would soon spread throughout the Japanese military hierarchy, forcing a fundamental reassessment of Japan's strategic position. The weight of Yamamoto's discovery grew heavier with each passing day. By December 1942, as Japanese forces prepared for what would be their final evacuation from Guadalcanal, the colonel had compiled a detailed report that would send shockwaves through the Japanese command structure. His analysis of the captured American supplies had revealed not just abundance, but a systematic approach to warfare that challenged every assumption Japanese military planners had made about their enemy. The evacuation itself, euphemistically called Operation Key by Japanese planners, was a masterpiece of tactical execution that couldn't hide the strategic disaster it represented. Under cover of darkness, Japanese destroyers and submarines managed to evacuate over 10,000 troops from Guadalcanal in a series of daring nighttime runs. But they left behind not just an island, but an entire worldview about how wars could be won. Yamamoto was among the last to leave, and as his destroyer pulled away from the dark silhouette of Guadalcanal, he carried with him more than just the bitter taste of defeat. He carried detailed intelligence about American industrial capacity that would fundamentally alter Japanese strategic planning for the remainder of the war. The journey back to Rabaul gave Yamamoto time to complete his analysis of what he had observed. The 50,000 ammunition crates were just the beginning. During his months on Guadalcanal, he had witnessed American supply operations that defied everything he thought he knew about military logistics. American cargo ships arrived with clockwork regularity, unloading not just ammunition and food, but vehicles, construction equipment, and even luxury items that seemed impossible to justify in a combat zone. The Americans had built roads, airfields, and port facilities with a speed and efficiency that seemed almost mechanical. They had established field hospitals equipped with medical supplies and equipment that surpassed what was available in many Japanese civilian hospitals. They had created a complete military infrastructure on a remote Pacific island in a matter of months, supported by supply lines that stretched across thousands of miles of ocean. But perhaps most impressive of all was the casual nature of American abundance. Yamamoto had observed American soldiers discarding equipment that Japanese forces would have considered precious. Empty ammunition crates were used as furniture or construction materials. Damaged vehicles were abandoned rather than repaired. Food was sometimes thrown away rather than carefully rationed. This wasn't the behavior of an army struggling with shortages or concerned about conservation. This was the behavior of an army that assumed unlimited supplies and unlimited replacement capacity. It suggested an industrial base so vast and productive that individual items had become essentially disposable. When Yamamoto's report reached Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo, it created a crisis of confidence that rippled through the highest levels of Japanese leadership. The colonel's detailed analysis of American supply operations, supported by photographs and captured documents, painted a picture of enemy capabilities that was far more alarming than anyone had anticipated. General Hideki Tojo, who served as both Prime Minister and War Minister, initially dismissed Yamamoto's conclusions as defeatist exaggeration. But as similar reports began arriving from other theaters of operation, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Japanese commanders in New Guinea reported American forces operating with similar abundance. Naval intelligence confirmed that American shipbuilding was proceeding at rates that seemed almost impossible. The numbers were staggering and undeniable. American shipyards were launching new vessels at a rate of several per day. Aircraft production had reached levels that dwarfed the combined output of all Axis nations. Ammunition production was so vast that American forces could afford to use artillery and air bombardment on scales that Japanese forces could never match. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack and no relation to the colonel, had always understood that Japan's only hope lay in achieving a quick, decisive victory that would force America to negotiate. The prolonged conflict that was developing was exactly what he had feared most. When he read Colonel Yamamoto's report, he reportedly told his staff, "We have awakened a sleeping giant, and now we are seeing it stretch its muscles." The industrial intelligence gathered on Guadalcanal revealed that American war production was not just larger than Japanese production, it was organized according to completely different principles. Japanese industry had always emphasized craftsmanship, precision, and careful use of materials. American industry, as revealed through the captured supplies, emphasized speed, standardization, and mass production on an unprecedented scale. The ammunition crates themselves told this story. Each crate was identical, manufactured to precise specifications that allowed for efficient packing, shipping, and storage. The ammunition inside was similarly standardized, with interchangeable components that simplified logistics and maintenance. This standardization allowed for production efficiencies that Japanese industry, with its emphasis on individual craftsmanship, could never match. But the implications went far beyond manufacturing efficiency. The standardization of American military equipment meant that replacement parts, ammunition, and supplies could be produced by multiple factories and used interchangeably across different units and theaters of operation. This created a logistical flexibility that Japanese forces, with their more specialized and unique equipment, could never achieve. Colonel Yamamoto's analysis also revealed the sophisticated transportation network that supported American operations. The supplies he had captured had been manufactured in dozens of different American cities, consolidated at major ports, shipped across the Pacific in purpose-built cargo vessels, and distributed through a complex logistics network that operated with mechanical precision. This transportation system was itself a weapon of war. The ability to move vast quantities of supplies across global distances meant that American forces could be sustained in operations that would be impossible for Japanese forces to maintain. It also meant that American industrial capacity could be concentrated in secure locations far from enemy attack, while still supporting operations anywhere in the world. The psychological impact of these revelations on Japanese leadership was profound. The entire Japanese strategy had been based on the assumption that American democracy was inherently weak, that American soldiers lacked fighting spirit, and that American industry, while large, was inefficient and vulnerable to disruption. The evidence from Guadalcanal suggested that all of these assumptions were wrong. American democracy, far from being weak, had proven capable of mobilizing resources on a scale that totalitarian Japan could not match. American soldiers, far from lacking fighting spirit, had proven willing to engage in prolonged, brutal combat when properly supplied and supported. American industry, far from being inefficient, had proven capable of producing weapons and supplies with a speed and efficiency that was almost supernatural. The strategic implications were clear and terrifying. If America could sustain the kind of supply operations that Yamamoto had observed on Guadalcanal, across multiple theaters of operation, then Japan was facing an enemy with essentially unlimited resources. The war of attrition that was developing would inevitably favor the side with greater industrial capacity and more abundant supplies. This realization forced a fundamental reassessment of Japanese strategy. The quick, decisive victory that Japanese planners had hoped for was clearly no longer possible. The question now was whether Japan could find some way to inflict such heavy casualties on American forces that public opinion would force a negotiated settlement. But even this hope was undermined by the evidence from Guadalcanal. American forces had proven willing to accept heavy casualties when they believed the strategic objectives justified the cost. More importantly, American industrial capacity meant that losses of equipment and supplies could be replaced quickly, while Japanese losses were becoming increasingly difficult to replace. The captured intelligence also revealed the scope of American strategic planning. Documents found among the supplies indicated that Guadalcanal was just one small part of a comprehensive strategy to systematically reduce Japanese positions throughout the Pacific. The Americans weren't just planning to defend their existing positions. They were planning offensive operations that would require resources on a scale that dwarfed anything Japan could match. These plans revealed a level of strategic confidence that was deeply unsettling to Japanese leaders. The Americans weren't planning desperate defensive operations or limited offensives designed to achieve negotiating leverage. They were planning systematic campaigns designed to completely destroy Japanese military power and occupy the Japanese home islands themselves. The industrial capacity that could support such ambitious plans was the same capacity that had casually abandoned 50,000 ammunition crates on a remote Pacific island. If America could afford to waste supplies on such a scale, what did that suggest about their ability to sustain major offensive operations across the entire Pacific theater? As 1943 progressed, the lessons learned from Yamamoto's discovery were confirmed by events across the Pacific. American forces launched major offensives in the Central Pacific, supported by naval and air forces that seemed to grow stronger with each engagement. Japanese defenders found themselves facing bombardments of unprecedented intensity, supported by supply lines that seemed immune to Japanese interdiction efforts. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 provided the final confirmation of American industrial supremacy. Japanese naval aviation, rebuilt after the disasters of 1942, was virtually annihilated in a single engagement. American pilots flying aircraft that were superior in every measurable way destroyed Japanese planes at ratios that made continued resistance seem futile. But it wasn't just the quality of American equipment that was decisive, it was the quantity. American carriers operated with aircraft complements that dwarfed Japanese capabilities. American pilots had received training that was far more extensive than Japanese pilots could afford. American ships carried ammunition loads that allowed for sustained combat operations that would have exhausted Japanese supplies in hours. Colonel Yamamoto, now promoted to general and serving on the staff of the combined fleet, watched these developments with the grim satisfaction of a prophet whose predictions had proven all too accurate. The 50,000 ammunition crates had been a warning sign that Japanese leadership had been slow to heed. By the time the full implications became clear, it was far too late to change course. The final vindication of Yamamoto's analysis came with the American invasion of the Philippines in October 1944. Japanese forces defending the islands found themselves facing an invasion fleet that seemed to stretch beyond the horizon. American supply ships arrived in seemingly endless convoys, unloading equipment and supplies that dwarfed anything Japanese forces had ever seen. The Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval engagement in history, saw Japanese naval forces make their final desperate attempt to disrupt American operations. But even this massive effort, which committed virtually every remaining Japanese warship to battle, could only temporarily slow American operations. Within days, American supply lines were restored, and the invasion proceeded with mechanical inevitability. General Yamamoto's final report, submitted in November 1944, was a masterpiece of military analysis that traced the arc of Japanese defeat back to the fundamental miscalculations revealed by those 50,000 ammunition crates. Japan had entered the war believing that fighting spirit could overcome material disadvantage, that quality could triumph over quantity, and that American democracy was inherently weak and inefficient. The evidence gathered over 2 years of combat had proven all of these beliefs to be dangerously wrong. American democracy had proven capable of mobilizing resources on a scale that exceeded anything in human history. American industry had demonstrated production capabilities that seemed almost unlimited. American military forces, properly supplied and supported, had proven capable of sustained operations that Japanese forces could never match. The war that Japan had started with such confidence had become exactly the kind of prolonged conflict that Japanese planners had hoped to avoid. And in that kind of war, the side with greater industrial capacity would inevitably prevail. The 50,000 ammunition crates had been a glimpse into America's true capabilities, and that glimpse had revealed the futility of continued resistance. As 1945 dawned, with American bombers systematically destroying Japanese cities and American submarines strangling Japanese supply lines, the lessons learned on Guadalcanal seemed prophetic. The industrial might that could casually abandon ammunition on a remote Pacific island was the same might that was now bringing the war to Japan's doorstep. The atomic bombs that ended the war in August 1945 were perhaps the ultimate expression of American industrial and scientific capability. The Manhattan Project had required resources and coordination on a scale that dwarfed even the massive supply operations that Yamamoto had observed in the Pacific. It represented the same systematic approach to warfare that had characterized American operations throughout the conflict. In the years that followed, as Japan rebuilt under American occupation, the lessons learned from those 50,000 ammunition crates would influence Japanese thinking about industrial development and military strategy. The abundance that had seemed so shocking in 1942 became a model for Japan's own post-war economic development. General Yamamoto survived the war and played a role in Japan's reconstruction, always carrying with him the memory of that October night on Guadalcanal when he had first glimpsed the true scale of American power. He often reflected on how different the war might have been if Japanese leaders had understood from the beginning what those ammunition crates represented. The 50,000 crates had been more than just military supplies. They had been a message about the kind of society that had produced them. They represented an industrial system that valued efficiency over tradition, abundance over scarcity, and systematic planning over individual heroism. They were the product of a democracy that had proven capable of mobilizing its entire population and economy for war without sacrificing its fundamental values. Today, as we look back on this pivotal moment in history, we can see how a single captured supply depot revealed truths that would reshape the entire Pacific War. The colonel who made that discovery understood, perhaps better than anyone else, that wars are ultimately won not by the bravest soldiers or the most brilliant generals, but by the societies that can best organize their resources for sustained conflict. The sound of those wooden crates being pried open in the darkness of Guadalcanal was more than just the noise of a tactical victory. It was the sound of one worldview colliding with another, and the moment when the true nature of the Pacific War was finally revealed. In those crates lay not just ammunition, but the future itself, and the recognition that the side with the greater industrial capacity would ultimately determine the shape of the post-war world.